This week, the nations of the world are gathering in Katowice, Poland, to review and, we hope, amplify their commitments to reduce carbon emissions under the 2015 Paris Agreement, and to discuss how they will report and verify reductions in carbon pollution. The United States of America is technically present in Poland in the form of a small delegation, but American leadership in Poland is decidedly absent. Why? It's pretty simple. The government of the United States of America has fallen under the political control of the industry most responsible for this mess. American leadership was essential to forging the global consensus on carbon emissions in the original Paris Agreement. I know because I was there in Paris in 2015 as Secretary Kerry and the U.S. negotiating team worked to seal the landmark pact. What a pathetic difference a few years make. In 2017, President Trump announced that the U.S. would become the only country in the world to turn its back on this global agreement. The United States abdicates its leadership just as the scientific warnings of the dangers of climate change grow clearer and grimmer. In October came a new report from the world's scientists working through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And just last month, our own federal government released its own sobering news about the worsening risks climate change poses to our nation and our economy. Our national climate assessment warned of hundreds of billions of dollars in losses we can anticipate due to climate change if we don't act to curtail carbon emissions. Trump responded first by describing his own, and I'll quote him on this, very high levels of intelligence, end quote. And then he went on to simply deny all the science because he said, I don't see it. Well, guess what? Pope Paul V didn't see it when Galileo demonstrated that the Earth revolved around the sun, but that didn't change the astrophysics. The climate science laid out in black and white by Trump's own government agencies is that our planet is heating up due to our use of fossil fuels. The science is even more incontrovertible than when Donald Trump said climate science was incontrovertible back in 2009. Saying that he now doesn't see it is the very definition of climate denial. So many people who are engaged in climate denial actually know better, but for a variety of motives, won't act, won't admit it. As to the president not seeing it, willful blindness would be another term. This takeover of our government by fossil fuel forces is having very real consequences in the United States emissions numbers. After years of decline, U.S. carbon emissions rose in 2018, increasing by 2.5%. This, of course, coincides with the Trump administration's efforts on behalf of its industry benefactors to delay, repeal, and weaken rules limiting carbon emissions from power plants, from oil and gas wells, from industrial facilities, even from vehicles. Of course, all of these industries share a measure of the blame for not cleaning up their own mess on their own. And you can add to that their culpability for pushing the Trump administration to weaken the safety regulations that in some cases the industry had actually agreed to. The auto industry had actually agreed to the CAFE standards and then fought to undo them through its trade group so they could keep their own hands clean. Chinese carbon emissions increased in 2018, as did Indian emissions. Among major economies, only the European Union saw its emissions decline in 2018. This is why international summits like Poland are so important. The world urgently needs to correct course, and we can best do so if countries together do their part to reduce emissions. According to the IPCC, to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change, we need to cut carbon emissions to 50% below 2010 levels by 2030, which is just 11 years from now. We've got to be 50% below our emissions in 2010, 11 years from now in 2030. And we have to hit net zero emissions, carbon removed for all carbon added, by 2050. That's not that far away. The IPCC report calls pricing carbon the central policy that will allow us to hold the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius or less. And this is not some fantasy of the environmental community. Some of the world's biggest investors, $32 trillion worth of investment represented by these groups, stood up in Poland to say, we need to fix this problem, or there will be economic catastrophe ahead. And they too said that a price on carbon and an end to the subsidy that the fossil fuel industry enjoys and that is at the heart of its political intervention that has prevented us from taking action on climate change needs to go. You've got to add a price on carbon, and you've got to get rid of the fossil fuel subsidies. That is their prescription for avoiding economic catastrophe. Well, maybe they don't know what they're talking about, but $32 trillion worth of money thinks that they know what they're talking about because they put their money in the hands of these people to make wise investments for the future. A lot of people have bet their savings and resources behind these groups that are now saying, no price on carbon, no end of the fossil fuel subsidies, watch out. Watch out for catastrophe. On an ideological level, if you are sincere about market capitalism, where the costs of a product need to be in the price of the product for the market to work, this is pretty obvious stuff. The only reason this gets difficult is if you're a fake free marketeer who's really fronting for the fossil fuel industry. But if you're not a fake on market economics when it's the industry who funds your party involved, it's pretty straightforward stuff. It's basic economic market principles. You put the public harm externalities of a product, those costs, into the price of the product for the market to work. Econ 101. Shows the priorities around here when market capitalism and the principles of free market economics are so readily thrown under the bus by our friends once they cross the interests of big donor industries. The good news is that many governments, from cities, states, and provinces to countries and regions, are already pricing carbon. This chart shows all of the various governments that have set a price on carbon, either through emissions trading, those are the green ones, or through a carbon price, a carbon fee, the various purple ones. And some do both, which is where they're mixed. The carbon fee involved will vary. Sweden, for example, charges almost $140 per ton of carbon emitted, covering nearly 50% of the nation's emissions. The Canadian province of British Columbia enacted a carbon fee in 2008, which has risen over time to its current price of $35 per ton. In the 4 years following the British Columbia carbon fee, fossil fuel use decreased by 17% in the province compared to increasing by 1% in the rest of Canada. So it works at decreasing emissions. And British Columbia's economy grew faster than that of any other Canadian province. And why would it not, when 100% of the revenues raised from British Columbia's carbon fee are returned to taxpayers in the form of other tax cuts? And it's popular. 70% of British Columbians support the policy. So what about the US? Well, California has put a price on carbon via an emissions trading system, as have the 9 northeastern states, including Rhode Island, that are members of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. For the moment, the prices in California and the RGGI states are still relatively low, around $5 for us in Rhode Island in RGGI. Senator Schatz and I have introduced our American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act again to assess a carbon fee starting at $50 per metric ton of emissions in 2019. It's the mid-range of the Office of Management and Budget's 2016 estimates of what they call the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is the name for the long-term damage that is done by carbon pollution, which the fossil fuel industry is fighting so hard to be a public subsidy rather than to be put into the price of their product. Our market-based proposal is an appeal to true conservative Republican colleagues. As one Republican former legislator said, it's not just an olive branch, it's an olive limb that we have offered. But the fossil fuel industry keeps a stranglehold on the Republican Party, preventing climate action, even climate action using market principles. Axios just did this chart. I saw it today and had it reproduced for the floor. This is the number of times climate change is mentioned in Congress, in press releases, floor statements, and online by members of Congress. This is how often Democrats have mentioned it from 2013 to 2018. I'm afraid I'm probably a measurable piece of those blue columns. But if you look over here, this is how often Republicans have mentioned climate change. Their best year was 678 mentions. All Republicans in Congress, all their press releases, floor statements, and online communications, grand total 678 mentions. I mean, seriously. And it's gone down as it's gotten worse, because I think it's difficult to talk about if you're a Republican. Everybody's looking around at the wildfires. Everybody's looking around at the sea level rise coming up. Everybody's looking around at the storms. Everybody's looking around at the science now not only warning of climate change, but being able to connect specific weather events to climate change. Most recently, the massive heat wave that wiped out so much of the Great Barrier Reef. So here's how often Republicans talk about it, and here's how often Democrats do. We should probably do better, but anyway, that's where we are. And if that doesn't show the effect of the industry squelching debate and driving Republicans into alignment with their industry welfare, then I don't know what could express that much more clearly. So I wanted to show that. And this is unlikely to change as long as millions of fossil fuel industry dollars slosh around Washington, protecting this corrupting industry from having to account, as economics would suggest, for the actual economic cost of its pollution. America is called the indispensable nation, and American leadership is indispensable if we're to achieve a global response to this global challenge. But American leadership is sorely lacking because the dark money and sleazy operatives of the fossil fuel industry today control the Trump administration and swaths of the Republican Party. Mr. President, there used to be a guy in this body who said country first. We could use a little of that now in this tragic, climate-denying Trump sleaze fest.